I want to take you to two places this morning. We're going to start in 2 Kings chapter 6, if you join me there. 2 Kings chapter 6. Pardon me. Special blessing to all of you who are Filipino, and thank you that you're having this special day. I've known Pastor Andy a long time. I've known a lot of you for a long time, and grateful for your hospitality. We always say the Filipinos are the group, they never age. They just are ageless people. I never meet any old Filipinos, and I guess I have, but you just don't show it. So, and then your gentility and your spirit of graciousness have always been something we've talked about as a family, and we're glad we could fall on this one day to celebrate with you. January of 2018, we were in Florida, and Andrew grew up at Providence Baptist Church in Riverview, Florida. So Brianna and Andrew were just a little over a year from getting married at that point. We had visited Andrew's church and were parked there in our trailer. Providence Baptist of Riverview was pastored at the time by my friend Dave Goforth. He's been a pastor for quite a while. We knew each other in college. So I was there on a Wednesday night, and Brother Dave was preaching a message on the kings of Israel, and I heard him give a challenge from the life of Elisha. It was phenomenal. And he talked about Elisha being rescued by a band of angels, an army of angels in fiery chariots. And it was incredible. And after I heard that message, I thought, man, I've got to preach that passage sometime. Well, it was Wednesday, so following the Bible study, we had prayer time, and we broke up in groups. And they did a neat thing there. The teenagers would pray with the adults, and so we had divided up. I was in a group with a pastor friend of mine, Pastor Mormon, had been in Maryland for years. Now he's retired and he's back at his home church. And so we were getting ready to pray. And he said, that was a really good message by our pastor tonight on Elisha. And he said, that happened, Brother Rich, in the town of Dothan. Of course, a lot of Americans know Dothan, Alabama. This is Dothan in Canaan. And he said, do you know anything else significant that happened in the city of Dothan? I thought about it. It was a Bible trivia question. I said, well, Pastor, I think I'd be lying if I said I do. I don't remember something else significant happened in Dothan. He said, Brother Rich, it was in Dothan that Joseph's brothers sold him into slavery, an event that would change his life from that point forward. He said, think about this. One man from Dothan gets a deliverance by an army of angels. Another gets delivered by his brothers into a band of Midianites, and he ends up in slavery in Egypt. But through the providence of God, he ends up being the deliverer for his whole family. And he said it's a powerful reminder. Not everybody gets delivered by a fiery band of angels. I got meditating on that. Thought, I got to preach on that. That's really good. And I've come up with this message I call Two Roads Out of the City of Two Wells. Two roads out of the city of two wells. And the name Dothan means city of two wells. I think you'll see the significance of that in a few moments. Let's go to 2 Kings chapter 6. I'm going to read from verse 8, and we'll go down to verse 23. I'll have you stay seated, but I want you to follow along with me as I read it. 2 Kings 6, verse 8. Then the king of Syria warred against Israel and took counsel with his servants, saying, in such and such a place shall be my camp. And the man of God sent unto the king of Israel, saying, beware that thou not pass such a place, for thither the Syrians are come down. The king of Israel sent to the place which the man of God told and warned him of, and saved himself there not once or twice. Therefore the heart of the king of Syria was sore troubled at this thing. He called his servants and said to them, will you not show me which of us is for the king of Israel? And one of his servants said, none, my lord, O king, but Elisha the prophet that is in Israel. He telleth the king of Israel the words that thou speakest in thy bedchamber. He said, go and spy where he is, that I may send and fetch him. It was told them, saying, behold, he's in Dothan. Therefore he sent hither his horses and chariots and a great host, and they came by night and compassed the city about, and the servant of the man of God was risen early and gone forth. Behold, a host compassed the city both with horses and with chariots. And his servant said to him, alas, my master, how shall we do? And he answered, fear not, for they that be with us are more than they that be with them. And Elisha prayed and said, Lord, I pray thee, open his eyes that he may see. The Lord opened the eyes of the young man, and he saw, behold, the mountain was full of chariots of horses and chariots of fire round about Elisha. When he came down to him, Elisha prayed unto the Lord and said, Smite this people, I pray thee, with blindness. And he smote them with blindness according to the word of Elisha. And Elisha said to them, This is not the way, neither is this the city. Follow me, I'll bring you to the man whom you seek. But he led them to Samaria. It came to pass, when they were come into Samaria, that Elisha said, Lord, open the eyes of these men that they may see. And the Lord opened their eyes, and they saw, and behold, they were in the midst of Samaria. The king of Israel said to Elisha when he saw them, My father, shall I smite them? Shall I smite them? He answered, Thou shalt not smite them. Wouldest thou smite them, whom thou hast taken with the sword and with the bow? Set bread and water before them, that they may eat and drink, and go to their master. And he prepared great provisions for them, and when they had eaten and drunk, he sent them away. They went to their master, so the bands of Syria came no more into the land of Israel. It's really a simple message. I'm going to give you 2 points. I want you to see the first is Elisha escorted out from enemies by an army of angels. Elisha escorted out from enemies by an army of angels. So you think about this, Elisha is being told by God, okay, here's where the Syrians are going to attack. Now, the Syrians are led by a king named Ben-Hadad. And Ben-Hadad, he says, how is it that every time we go to attack Israel, they're there waiting for us? Can you imagine if you're in military, somebody's giving military secrets out, so your battle plan is spoiled. They know exactly where the attack's going to come. And he says, who's the traitor among us? Who's working for Israel? And one of his men, and I don't know how he knew this, but one of his men said, no, it's none of your guys. It's Elisha, the prophet. Everything you say in private in your bedroom, he hears it. He says, you go get me Elisha. Find out where he is. So they find out. He's in Dothan. So the king sends an army. They surround the city with this army. And one morning early, the servant of Elisha wakes up and he goes out and he looks all around him. He thought, uh-oh, the city is surrounded. I mean, can you imagine? It'd be like waking up in Kiev right now, Kiev. Wake up and you've got tanks all around you. Do you think if you're a citizen of the city, you might be feeling a little foreboding in your heart? And the servant, I can imagine, drops the water pot and runs back in. Master, come quickly. And Elisha doesn't even go with him. He says, don't be afraid. Those with us are more in number than those with them. Now, how does Elisha know that? Is it possible that God gave Elisha a sneak peek of the fiery chariots and the horses round about the city? Did he have some kind of special night vision capability that he could see all the horses surrounding the city? I don't think so. Scripture says we walk by faith, not by sight. Elisha hadn't seen that, but he prayed. He said, Lord, would you open my servant's eyes so he'll see it? And all of a sudden the servant looks, and surrounding the army of Syria is the army of heaven. Their fiery chariots, their heavenly horses out there, and indeed they are more numerous than the army of the Syrians. So Elisha prayed, Lord, open his eyes. And so his eyes were open, the servant, and all of a sudden he sees these men. And then when the host is realizing they're surrounded by an army of angelic beings, God says, okay, Lord, I pray that you'll smite the Syrian army with blindness. So open my servant's eyes. God did that. Now smite them with blindness. And now all of a sudden the whole Syrian army is blind. Now think about this. If you're in the Syrian army, most likely you've never been blind before. I mean, you know, if you're going to be an infantryman, you really do have to have your sight, right? And so you figure they were not brought into this army because of some infirmity that would limit them from battle. So now all of a sudden the whole host of them goes blind. And I can imagine them feeling around. They don't know what to do as a blind person. They haven't lived with this handicap. And so Elisha says, guys, you're in the wrong place, the wrong city, but I'll take you to the man you want to see. Man, is this the setup of all setups? So he says, follow me. And it's a 12-mile journey to go from Dothan to Samaria. Well, how did they get there? Oh, I can only imagine. Each one's got his hand in front of his buddy. So how are they going to... Can you imagine an entire army marching like this 12 miles? That's going to take a while. A blind army marching 12 miles. So this literally happened. So they get to Samaria, and when they get into Samaria, which is the capital of northern Israel, okay, King Joram at the time, and they come in, and Elisha prays another prayer. He says, okay, Lord, would you now restore their sight? And all of a sudden, they're looking around and, oh, this is not good. They are in the middle of the capital of Israel, the northern tribes, Samaria. Remember the northern tribes when they split off the southern tribes? And they thought, we, you know, if I put it in the vernacular, we're toast. We're done. This is it. And so the king says to him, my master, Elisha, shall I kill them all? Shall I smite them? He says, no, you're not going to smite them. What would you do if you took them in battle? You'd give them provision, you'd take care of the needs, and you'd send them back to your master. So they did that. And at this point, the Syrians do not come back anymore. You think, man, that is an incredible account, and it is incredible. It's really a testimony to God's supernatural ability. So I heard that account that night, and I thought, man, that is absolutely amazing. I'm enthralled when I hear that story. So let me remind you, right after hearing that Bible study, I got with Pastor Mormon, my retired pastor friend. He said, Brother Rich, that was a really amazing account our pastor related tonight, wasn't it? And I said, yeah, that is incredible. He said, that happened at Dothan. You remember there was some other incident that happened at Dothan. I said, Brother Mormon, I'd be a liar if I said I did. I don't recall. He said, yeah, what was the other significant thing that happened at Dothan in Israel's history? He said, that's where Joseph's brothers sold Joseph into slavery. So I want you to go to that account with me. It's in Genesis chapter 37, if you will. Genesis 37. And there is another key principle here. We have Joseph betrayed by his brothers to enslavement in Egypt. This is the second of the 2 points I want you to get. Joseph enslaved by his brothers to imprisonment in Egypt, or enslavement in Egypt. It's Genesis 37. Let me pick up in verse 12 with you there in the text. Genesis 37:12. His brethren went to feed their father's flock in Shechem, and Israel said to Joseph, do not thy brethren feed the flock in Shechem? Come, I'll send thee unto them. He said, here am I. He said to him, go, I pray thee, see whether it is be well with thy brethren, and well with the flocks, and bring me word again. So he sent him. So he sent him, and he came to Shechem. And a certain man found him. Behold, he was wandering in the field, and the man asked him, saying, what seekest thou? He said, well, I seek my brethren. Tell me, I pray thee, where they feed their flock. The man said, oh, they're departed hence, for I heard them say, let us go to Dothan. Now, let me just kind of set this up as we're going along. So his father, Jacob, Israel, says, hey, the other guys, the 10 brothers, have gone up to feed the sheep and the flocks. They found good pasture land north of here. So I want you to go to Shechem, go check on them. Well, I went back and did a little research. Where they lived at the time is Hebron. From Hebron to Shechem is about 55 miles. Now, you don't just jump in a car and drive 55 miles back then. There's no car. How did he get there? Most likely, he's on foot. Maybe he had some kind of, donkey. I don't know. But most likely, he's a teenage kid. He's on foot. He's 17 years old at the time. So his dad says, I want you to go to check on your brothers. Okay, so 55 miles. And the only town of size that he would go through on that journey would be Jerusalem. Other than that, he's out in nowhere by himself. How many of you would send your 17-year-old kid on a journey all by himself? So he's got to camp out at night. He's got, you trust him to... You feel bad enough when you turn over the car keys. Can you imagine? Yeah, just take your 55-mile journey. This is going to be days of journey. And there's no cell phone. There's no text me when you get there, okay? You go check on them and then come back and bring me word. This kid's going to be gone for a while. So he goes, and what happens? Verse 17. The man said, they departed from hence. I heard them say, let us go to Dothan. And Joseph went after his brethren and found them in Dothan. Okay, that's another 12 miles. So he's already gone 55 miles plus 12. That's 17 miles, at least 67, maybe 70 miles by the time this is all done. By the way, how did this complete stranger know who he was looking for? Well, think it's a band of 10 brothers who are from out of town, okay? Oh, yeah, the 10 brothers with all the animals. Yeah, I heard it talk. They're going up. Joseph doesn't know for sure whether he can trust this guy. He just takes his word. So he goes on. Verse 18. When they saw him afar off, even before he came near to them, they conspired against him to slay him. Now, think about this. Joseph's been days without seeing anybody he knows. So when he sees his brothers afar off, he's like, yes, it's my family. And what do they say? Oh, boy, here comes Mr. Dreamer. Remember when he was a kid, he had the dreams that everybody in the family would bow down to him? The sun, moon, and stars would bow down to his star. That represented his mom and dad and his brothers. They're like, here comes the dreamer. And they literally plot to kill him. We're going to take this guy out. Verse 19, they said, behold, this dreamer cometh. Come now, therefore, let us slay him and cast him into some pit. We'll say, some evil beast have devoured him, and we'll see what will become of his dreams. And Reuben heard it, and he delivered him out of their hands and said, let us not kill him. Reuben's the oldest, so he's got some sense of responsibility here. Reuben said to them, shed no blood, but cast him into this pit that is in the wilderness, and lay no hand upon him, that he might rid them out of their hands, to deliver him to his father again. It came to pass, when Joseph was come unto his brethren, that they stripped Joseph out of his coat of many colors that was on him. They took him and cast him into a pit. The pit was empty. There was no water in it. And they sat down to eat bread, and they lifted up their eyes. Behold, a company of Ishmaelites came from Gilead with their camels, bearing spices and balm and myrrh, going to carry it then down to Egypt. Judah said to his brethren, what profit is it if we slay our brother and conceal his blood? Come now, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites. Let not our hand be upon him, for he's our brother and our flesh. And his brethren were content. There passed by Midianites, merchantmen. They drew and lifted up Joseph out of the pit and sold Joseph to the Ishmaelites for 20 pieces of silver, and they brought Joseph into Egypt. Now let me just pause here for a minute. So what's going on? They see him come, and they know because he's got this multicolored coat. Back then, most people wore very drab clothing. It took a lot of effort to dye things with any color. So most of your colors were tan or gray or whatever. You know, they would wear linen. And, anything weaved would just be plain color. But Joseph's father showed him favor by giving him this multicolored coat. Pay attention to how many times a coat comes into the narrative with Joseph, too. So they see him like, oh, boy, here comes the kid. Here comes the dreamer. And they say, let's kill him. Dad's not around. We'll take his coat back to Dad, and we'll tell him some evil beast must have devoured him. Is this your sons? We found this along the journey. And who's to tell him otherwise? And Reuben thinks, oh, man, what am I going to do? My brothers are insane. They're going to try to kill him. Now, not that Reuben was, a person of character, but he's got some sense of responsibility, so he thinks, all right, we got to do something here. So they throw him into a pit. Now, this is where the story gets interesting. The pit was an empty cistern. You know what a cistern is? It's a well. Interesting. Dothan is called the city of two wells. It was unusual that a city would have two wells. Why would there be two wells? It's perhaps because one had gone dry, so they had to dig another well. So the very area that should have been life-sustaining, this cistern, now becomes a cell for Joseph. So they throw him in the cistern, in the old dry well, and I can imagine, fellas, come on, let me out of here. Do you think he just took it passive? What are we doing, guys? Can't we negotiate? Meanwhile, they're up talking. Judah says, if we let this rascal out, we kill him, then his blood's on our hand. Hey, look, merchants. That's what we do. We sell them into slavery, and then we make money off the deal. Plus, we're not the ones responsible for what happens to them. We solve two problems, and we profit from it. Can you imagine such treachery within a family? Maybe some of you can. Maybe some of you have dealt with it. The amazing thing to me about Joseph's life is through all of the betrayal that he experienced, through all the lies brought against him, Joseph never becomes bitter or turns his back on God. Keep reading. What happens here? I left off in verse 29. Reuben returned to the pit. Behold, Joseph was not in the pit. He rent his clothes. He returned to his brethren and said, the child is not, and I, whither shall I go? They took Joseph's coat and killed a kid of the goats and dipped the coat in the blood. They sent the coat of many colors, and they brought it to their father and said, this have we found. Know now whether it be thy son's coat or no. And he knew it and said, it is my son's coat. An evil beast hath devoured him. Joseph is without doubt rent in pieces. And Jacob rent his clothes and put sackcloth upon his loins and mourned for his son many days. And all his sons and all his daughters rose up to comfort him. But he refused to be comforted. He said, I will go down to the grave unto my son mourning. Thus his father wept for him, and the Midianites sold him to Egypt unto Potiphar, and an officer of unto Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh's, and captain of the guard. Now a lot of you know where this account goes from here. Joseph gets sold into slavery. He ends up in Egypt. What happens in Egypt? Well, initially he's at Potiphar's house, and Potiphar is, again, officer of Pharaoh. Some believe he's in charge of the prison. He's an officer of the guard. Maybe the prison guard in this case. And Potiphar is a very successful man. Meanwhile, back in Hebron, what happens? Joseph's brothers sent the coat to their father. Most likely they sent by servants of theirs, said, take this to our dad, tell him you found this coat. They let him draw his own conclusions, and what does he think? You talk about living with a life of false guilt. He thinks, I sent my son on an errand to tell me how the boys were doing, and my poor son, obviously, look at this bloody coat. He's been attacked by some beast. And his dad lives with the false conclusion that Joseph has been devoured by an animal. And you think about every day he's living with guilt. It's my fault. I sent him up there. Sometimes you and I live with guilt that is self-imposed, not God-imposed. When God brings guilt, guilt is meant to bring conviction so there can be repentance. But when Satan sends guilt, there's no resolution to it. You just live with the remorse and you think, I'm in this hole of no hope, as it were. Listen, God never brings guilt without a solution. Satan sends guilt to keep you absolutely incapacitated. But God brings guilt, he brings conviction to give you hope, to give you repentance, to give you cleansing. That's the difference between the way God operates and the way the enemy operates. So here Joseph goes off to prison. What happens? Goes off to Potiphar's house. What happens there? Well, Potiphar's got a trophy wife. A lot of those Egyptians did. And it's all about appearances, all about status in Egypt. And Potiphar's wife sees this attractive young man come into their home, and she conspires to commit adultery with him. She tries to get this kid enticed. And in fact, she can't believe she's not successful, because what young man separated from his family wouldn't engage in fleshly lust? Well, one who's committed to God. And Joseph was. She'd never met a man like this. And she couldn't get him to succumb. And so what happened? She kept trying. It wasn't a one-time thing. She tried repeatedly to entice him into a relationship, and he would not. One day he goes into the house, take care of business. Potiphar had put everything under his hand. Potiphar didn't even know how much money he had in his own possession. And Joseph took care of all that. And Potiphar's wife finds him in the house, and she says, come lie with me. I mean, you talk about blatant. And I don't want you to get the idea, what we know historically, that this is some haggard old woman. Most likely, Potiphar, in a man in a position like his, would have an attractive wife. And now, talk about her lack of morals. Now she's trying to entice Joseph, and what does he do? He literally flees her clutches. And here's where the coat comes into the story again. Whatever coat he's wearing now, he literally runs as she rips the outer tunic off of his body, the outer cloak off his body, and he flees. So now she's got the opportunity to frame him. She says to some of the other household servants, look how the master of the house brought this man in to shame us. And she turns the story, it's Joseph's fault. He tried to rape me. Now that's not true. And by the way, this is why integrity matters. Boy, have you paid attention to the whole Johnny Depp and Heard situation last week? You know, what about believe every woman? Well, look, all people have problems. This is why we need to trust credibility. We need to establish credibility. Women are to be believed, men are to be believed, people are to be believed if their story's credible. What if it's not credible? Then it's not to be believed. This is where you got to develop discernment. Potiphar's wife, she's ready to frame him. He tried to rape me. Not true. But there's no witness. So what happens? Joseph's in God's hands. And by the way, you and I are too. There'll be times when people may bring false accusations. Your job is to make sure that the accusations are false. You're to be a person of character. But what if my character's been besmirched? What if it's been destroyed by somebody's lies? You can leave that in God's hands. Joseph did. And so what happens to him? He gets put in prison. Now look, Potiphar could have had him killed. I mean, if the allegations were true that he tried to rape his wife, some slave tries to rape a wife, that would have been cause for death. Something tells me Potiphar didn't completely believe his wife's story. However, he's got to save face. I mean, imagine admitting that his wife was the one responsible. That looks bad on him as well. So what does he do? He has Joseph put in the prison. But if it's true that Potiphar is over the guard, and if it's true that he's got connections with the prison guard, what happens there? The man who's in charge of the prison promotes Joseph. He becomes top dog in the prison. Have you noticed everywhere Joseph went, he ends up in the top position? Interesting. And what's God doing? God is working a providential web all through this matter of Joseph's life. And Joseph ends up in the prison, and he's promoted. The prison keeper trusts him with everything. And one day, 2 of Pharaoh's officers end up thrown into prison. You remember it was the butler and the baker. There's the butler and the baker. I don't know what happened to the candlestick maker, but the butler and the baker got thrown into prison, okay? And they were both out of favor with Pharaoh, and one day they have these dreams. And Joseph said, well, there's a God in heaven who can interpret dreams. Tell me what your dreams are. And the butler tells him, here's my dream. And he says, oh, well, what your dream means is you're going to be restored to Pharaoh's palace in 3 days. And the baker says, oh, I like that. Tell me what my dream means. And he had this dream that he's got these baskets of bread on his head, and the birds come and eat the bread off the baskets. And Joseph said, well, yours is not so good. In 3 days, you're going to be your head's going to be lifted off your body. You're going to be beheaded. And that's what happened. The baker is killed. The butler is restored to the palace. Joseph has the opportunity to make an appeal to Pharaoh. He says, look, I've been sent here under false pretenses. And he says to the butler, would you remember me before Pharaoh? And what does Pharaoh say? I'm sorry, what does the butler say? Oh, yeah, I'll tell him. And then he forgets. You remember how long he forgot? 2 years. 2 more years this goes on. One day, Pharaoh has a dream. It so troubles him, he says, I got to have somebody interpret this. The butler says, oh, now I remember my evil, my error. Pharaoh, there's a guy in prison. I met Joseph. He can interpret your dream. So Pharaoh has him come. Remember, Pharaoh actually had 2 dreams. One about the lean stalks and the fat stalks, and then the lean cows and the fat cows. And Joseph says, well, here's the deal. You're going to have 7 years of abundance, 7 years of plenty in Egypt, but they're going to be followed by 7 years of famine that are so severe that those years of famine are going to wipe out everything previously, and so you better start planning ahead. You better start stockpiling. And Pharaoh says, who could be wiser in my palace than this man? And so he makes Joseph his right-hand man. He becomes viceroy, which is like the governor of Egypt. He's the most powerful person in Egypt beside Pharaoh himself. You talk about a roller coaster of a ride. Well, the 7 years go by. Joseph plans, they stockpile, etc. But eventually famine comes. And it not only affects Egypt, it affects neighboring areas, which includes Canaan, which includes where Joseph's brothers and father are. All these years have gone by. How many years? When Joseph finally meets his brothers, he's 30 years old. He was 17 when they sold him into slavery. 13 wild years have gone by. And you remember the story when and that's a whole convoluted story in itself, when they finally come to Egypt to get grain and they realize this, man, there's a lot of food here in Egypt. And Joseph loads up their grain sacks, and he doesn't make himself known. He knows who they are. They have no idea. He's probably got the Egyptian haircut by that. You remember they had shave it on the side. And he's probably, well, evidently he's not speaking their language anymore. He's speaking the Egyptian language. They have no clue. They thought, they sold him to slavery. Who's expecting him to be governor? But he knows who they are. And incredible, he sends them home. And you remember their money is in the mouth of their sacks, and they all have a panic attack. Eventually, Joseph wants to corroborate their story. He says, how do I know you haven't come to spy out the land? Oh, no, we're 12 brothers. Well, one of our brothers is dead, but the youngest is at home. He says, there are 10 of you. If your story's true, I want you to bring your youngest brother to me. Oh, they're thinking, we had to open our mouth. Their dads, when they go back to get their brother, remember they put Simeon in jail and keep him, a kind of collateral. They send him home to get Benjamin. Their father says, no way, over my dead body. My favorite son is already dead. You're not taking Benjamin. So they go a few weeks or months or whatever, and the food runs out, and finally he says, boys, go back and get us more food. They said, Dad, he's not going to deal with us. Simeon's still in prison there. He's not going to deal with us unless you send Benjamin back. And Jacob realizes there's nothing he can do about it. He's got to send him back. And so what does he do? He sends him back. And Joseph finally makes himself known to his brothers. I want you to see, it's chapter 45. Jump over to Genesis 45 for a minute. Starts in verse 1, Genesis 45, verse 1. And you got to imagine what these brothers are thinking when this day unfolds. Then Joseph could not refrain himself before them that stood by him. He cried, cause every man to go out from me. There stood no man with him while Joseph made himself known to his brethren. He wept aloud. The Egyptians of the house of Pharaoh heard. Joseph said to his brethren, I am Joseph. Doth my father yet live?" His brethren could not answer him, for they were troubled at his presence. That's like the understatement of the world. Can you imagine? Verse 4, Joseph said to his brethren, "Come near to me, I pray you." And they came near. He said, "I am Joseph, your brother, whom you sold into Egypt. Now therefore be not grieved, nor angry with yourselves that you sold me hither, for God did send me before you to preserve life. For these 2 years hath the famine been in the land, and yet there are 5 years in the which there shall neither be earing nor harvest. God sent me before you to preserve you a posterity in the earth, to save your lives by a great deliverance. So now it was not you that sent me hither, but God." Man, there's more that could be said. I'd also give you Genesis 50, verses 15 to 21. I won't take time to read that, but that's where after their dad dies, and they're sure now he's going to lower the boom on them and take vengeance, he says, no. You meant evil against me, but God meant it for good. He said, He sent me before you to preserve life, and He said, I will nourish you and your little ones. Amazing. The first account we looked at, 2 Kings chapter 6, Elisha, escorted out from his enemies by an army of angels. Incredible story of deliverance. But the second one here, Joseph, betrayed by his brothers to enslavement in Egypt. One account shows God's direct protection from evil. The second account shows God's direction through evil. And all of it is God. You say, why does it seem so often that I don't get the miraculous deliverance? I don't have those army of angel kind of stories. All mine are like, go to this doctor and that doctor, or go to this therapist, or go to, whatever your situation has been. Let me end with a story that just came to my attention last week. I have seldom heard the like. It's from a book called Legacies of Light. It's a collection of missionary biographies, and I had never heard of this couple, David and Svea Flood. Svea, S-V-E-A, is a Swedish name. And they lived in Sweden in the early 1900s. Listen to this. Incredible. In 1921, David Flood and his young wife Svea and their little 2-year-old son left Sweden for the interior of Africa. They traveled with another young missionary couple, the Ericssons. These two couples were active in church as church members. They sang in choir, and Svea played the violin and was a church soloist. But they'd committed their lives to taking the gospel to reaching the tribes in Africa. They were filled with enthusiasm and optimism as they literally hacked their way through the mountains of the Congo, eager to begin their ministry at some yet undetermined, unreached village. To their surprise, however, one village after another refused them entrance, convinced that they would anger the village gods and bring great trouble upon the people. After days of carrying their own supplies, they were hungry and weak. They prayed as they reached another village on the side of a mountain that they would finally find rest and ministry opportunities. But the chief in this village was even more hostile than all the others, and he demanded that they leave. They carried their supplies farther up the mountain. They put up their tents. They went their way. They were too weary to set out again. So they decided to clear brush and build mud huts and do their best to reach the hostile villagers. During the next agonizing weeks, which had stretched into months, David and Svea Flood struggled with learning Swahili, and along with the Ericssons, tried everything they could to reach out to the villagers below. The village chief only tightened his grip on the people. The people were prohibited from even visiting the missionaries, except for one little boy, who was allowed to go up and sell them chickens and eggs. David was amazed at his wife's insistence that while they may never reach the village and probably would never impact Africa, she could perhaps win this child for Jesus Christ. Every time the boy visited the camp, she showered him with love and attention. Sure enough, one afternoon, the other missionaries watched as Svea knelt with this little boy and led him in a prayer of repentance. The boy had to keep his decision for Christ a secret in the village, lest he not be allowed to return, or even worse. Eventually, the Ericssons decided to leave David and Svea and their little boy and to return to an established mission station many miles away. Even though the Flood family had battled malaria and desperately crude conditions, they decided to stay. Sometime later, Svea announced that she was expecting their second child. She was already weak and struggling physically, and David feared the worst. It was too late to travel through the jungles of the Belgian Congo without risking their life and the life of their unborn child. The baby would have to be born in the mud hut on the mountain. The newly converted boy carried the news back to the village, and the chief, surprisingly, allowed one of the women to serve as a midwife. By the time the baby was due, Svea Flood was weak with malaria. When the African midwife arrived, Svea was groaning in pain and suffering from high fever. When the little girl was born, Svea whispered that she was to be called Aina, A-I-N-A, Aina, a classic name for Swedish girls. 17 days later, Svea Flood died. Hopeless and filled with bitter anger, David dug a crude grave for his 27-year-old wife. How could he possibly care for his young son, plus a sickly little baby girl without assistance? He hired a young man from the village along with several others and took the children down the mountain to the mission station. He was finished with ministry, the gospel, and God. As far as he was concerned, God had taken the life of his faithful bride, and their ministry had been nothing less than a tragic waste. Returning to Sweden was a monumental task for David. He knew he had no one to care for, or feed his baby girl. The Eriksons had been unable to have children, so David offered them the opportunity to adopt Aina. They were thrilled at the chance and agreed to do so. With that, David took his son and left the station, never to return again. He never even looked back. Before Aina turned 1 year old, Joel and Bertha Erikson's food was poisoned by unbelieving natives. They died within days of each other. Aina was once again without parents, but she was soon claimed by another missionary couple and raised as their own daughter. When she was 3 years old, Aina and her adoptive parents left the mission field of Africa for good and eventually settled in South Dakota. Her Swedish given name was changed to Aggie. Aggie would later write that even as a young girl, she knew she was different. She would become known as the daughter of the missionary who died on the mountain, rescued by missionaries who were poisoned, and as her biography title says, she would become a girl without a country. Eventually, Aggie attended North Central Bible College in Minneapolis and married a godly young man who entered the ministry. Years went by. Aggie had no information about her father and knew very little of her past. She knew her parents' names, of course, and that their homeland was Sweden, but that was about it. She hardly had time to think about it. With a husband and a family and a busy ministry, her husband, Dewey Hurst, had become a president of a Bible college in Seattle, Washington. Then one day, unexpectedly, a Swedish religious magazine appeared in her mailbox. She had no idea who sent it. She couldn't read the words, but as she turned the pages, one photograph arrested her attention. It was a picture of a small white cross planted in the earth over an obvious burial site, and on the cross was the name Svea Flood. She immediately took the magazine to a college professor who could translate the article. The professor translated as she read, telling how two missionaries pushing through the African jungle, camping at night, traveling by day, came across a village in the Belgian Congo and found the burial plot they had photographed. They began to inquire and found that this grave was the grave of a missionary who had died shortly after giving birth to a baby girl, but not before leading one African boy to Christ. The woman's widowed husband had left their daughter in the hands of fellow missionaries. The article continued, saying, sadly, Svea Flood didn't live long enough to learn that little African boy they had won to Christ on that mountaintop in time went on to gain permission from the village chief to start and build a school. Gradually, this now mature young man, teacher and leader, taught the gospel of Christ, and all his students came to trust in Jesus Christ as well. Then they evangelized their parents, and even the chief became a Christian. Now the village had 600 believers and an active church professing Jesus Christ as Lord and Savior. All this came from the sacrifice and tears of the sowing of David and primarily Svea Flood. Aggie couldn't believe the news. She began to cry and thank God for letting her learn the truth of her parents and their sacrifice of the harvest and the harvest of fruit. For their 25th wedding anniversary, the Bible College gave the Hurst a vacation to Sweden, where, among other things, Aggie could search for her father. It wasn't difficult to find his family. David Flood had remarried and had 4 more children before his second wife also died. Now an old man, he was wasting away as an alcoholic, a professed agnostic who dared anyone to talk to him about God. After a joyous meeting with her half-brothers and half-sisters, Aggie brought up the subject of seeing their father. Her siblings weren't too optimistic about it. Their father had become deeply bitter. He had little to do with any of them, and most of all, he hated God. They warned her whenever he heard the name of God, he flew into a rage. Aggie was determined to see him. She eventually made her way to his little apartment, where the door was answered by a housekeeper. Inside the room were liquor bottles on every windowsill. The table was covered with more bottles, and in the far corner was a small, wrinkled old man lying on a rumpled bed, his head turned away. Diabetes and a stroke had confined him to this one room for the past 3 years. "Papa," she said tentatively. He turned and began to cry. "Aina, I never meant to give you away." "It's all right, Papa. God took care of me." The man instantly stiffened. The tears stopped. God forgot all of us. Our lives have been like this because of him. He turned his face back to the wall. Aina stroked his face and then continued, undaunted, "Papa, I've got a little story to tell you. It's a true one. You didn't go to Africa in vain. Mama didn't die in vain. The little boy you won to the Lord grew up to win that whole village to Jesus Christ. The one seed you planted just kept growing and growing. Today there are 600 African people serving the Lord because you were faithful to the call of God in your life. Papa, Jesus loves you. He has never hated you." The old man turned back to look into his daughter's eyes. His body relaxed. He began to talk. By the end of that afternoon, he had come back to the God he had resented for so many decades. Over the next few days, the father and daughter enjoyed warm moments together. Aggie and her husband soon had to return to America, and within a few weeks, David Flood had gone into eternity. Let me give you an addendum to this remarkable story. A few years later, Aggie and her husband attended an evangelism conference in London. A report was given from the nation of Zaire, formerly the Belgian Congo, by the superintendent of the National Church Association. He represented over 100,000 baptized believers. He spoke of the amazing spread of the gospel in his country. Afterward, Aggie rushed forward to ask him if he'd ever heard of her parents, David and Svea Flood. "Yes, madam," the man replied in French, his words then translated into English. "It was Svea Flood who led me to Jesus Christ. I was the boy who brought food to your parents before you were born. In fact, to this day, your mother's grave and her memory are honored by all of us." He embraced her in a long, sobbing hug, and then he continued, "You must come to Africa to see, because your mother is the most famous person in our history." She agreed. After months of planning, Aggie and her husband made the long journey back to the place of her birth. They eventually arrived at the outpost where they'd been given, which had been given by her father to the Ericksons. This was the outpost where she had lived as a little toddler, playing in the dirt with her African friends, learning the Swahili language. There she visited the grave of her first adoptive parents. Then she drove several miles to the village her parents had desperately tried to reach. Only this time, there were hundreds of villagers waiting and cheering as she came into view. They had built arches covered with flowers for her reception. Eventually, the pastor of the village church took her up to the hill, the place beneath a grove of trees. This was where her parents' mud house once stood. This was where she was born. He then pointed to a simple grave overlooking the valley below. Marking the grave was that small white cross. On it was written, Svea Flood, 1896 to 1923. Aggie was standing where her mother had stood, declaring the gospel to one small boy. Now she knew the harvest seed her mother had sown. Later in the church, with believing villagers crowded around, the pastor read the words of Psalm 126, verse 5, "They that sow in tears shall reap in joy." God knows what it means to weep. God knows what it means to suffer loss. God knows what it means to sow seed that doesn't seem to bear fruit. And the fruit of his gospel seed, you and me, the fruit of our efforts, along with people like David and Svea Flood and hundreds of African and villagers and millions of others, will live forever. Dothan, city of two wells. Man, Elisha, rescued by an army of angels. Yeah. But then there's Joseph. Why doesn't God come through every time with an army of angels? Sometimes the army of angels is the quick fix. But we know this, all things work together for good to them that love God. And I will tell you one thing. Svea Flood, who died as a 27-year-old in that place in Africa, never had any idea that one little boy would go on to be the means by which over 100,000 came to saving faith. You've got no idea what your life may mean for the cause of Christ. But there's one thing required of you and me, that a man be found faithful. Faithful.